The Secret Garden, Chapter 14. A Young Rajah. The moor was hidden in mist when the morning came, and the rain had not stopped pouring down. There could be no going out of doors. Martha was so busy that Mary had no opportunity of talking to her, but in the afternoon she asked her to come and sit with her in the nursery. She came, bringing the stocking she was always knitting when she was doing nothing else. "What's the matter with thee?" she asked, as soon as they sat down. "Thou looks as if thou'd something to say." I have found out what the crying was," said Mary. Martha let her knitting drop on her knee and gazed at her with startled eyes. "Thou hasn't!" she exclaimed. "Never!" "I heard it in the night," Mary went on, "and I got up and I went to see where it came from. It was Colin. I found him." Martha's face became red with fright. "Eh, Miss Mary," she said, half crying, "thou shouldn't have done it. Thou shouldn't. Thou'll get me in trouble. I never told thee nothing about him, but thou'll get me in trouble. I shall lose my place, and what'll mother do?" "You won't lose your place," said Mary. "He was glad I came. We talked, and he said he was glad I came." "Was he?" cried Martha. "Art thou sure? Thou doesn't know what he's like when anything vexes him. He's a big lad to cry like a baby, but when he's in passion he'll fair scream just to frighten us. He knows us daren't call our souls our own." "He wasn't vexed," said Mary. "I asked him if I should go away, and he made me stay. He asked me questions, and I sat on a big footstool, and I talked to him about India and about the robin and gardens. He wouldn't let me go. He let me see his mother's picture, and before I left him I sang him to sleep." Martha fairly gasped with amazement. "I can scarcely believe thee," she protested. "It's as if thou'd walked straight into the lion's den. If he'd been like he is most times, he'd have throwed himself into one of his tantrums and raised the house. He won't let strangers look at him." "He let me look at him. I looked at him all the time, and he looked at me. We stared," said Mary. "I don't know what to do," cried agitated Martha. "If Mrs. Medlock finds out, she'll think I broke orders and told thee, and I'll be packed back to me mother." "He's not going to tell Mrs. Medlock anything about it yet. It's to be a sort of secret, just at first," said Mary firmly. "And he says everybody is obliged to do as he pleases." "Aye, that's true enough. The bad lad," sighed Martha, wiping her forehead with her apron. "He says Mrs. Medlock must, and he wants me to come and talk to him every day, and you are to tell me when he wants me." "Me?" said Martha. "I shall lose my place. I shall for sure." "You can't if you're doing what he wants you to do, and everybody is ordered to obey him," Mary argued. "Dost thou mean to say," cried Martha with her wide open eyes, "that he was nice to thee?" "I think he almost liked me," Mary answered. "Then thou must have bewitched him," decided Martha, drawing a long breath. "Do you mean magic?" inquired Mary. "I've heard about magic in India, but I can't make it. I just went into his room, and I was so surprised to see him that I stood and stared, and then he turned round and stared at me, and he thought that I was a ghost or a dream, and I thought perhaps he was. And it was so queer being there alone together in the middle of the night and not knowing about each other. And we began to ask each other questions, and when I asked him if I must go away, he said I must not." "The world's coming to an end," gasped Martha. "What is the matter with him?" asked Mary. "Nobody knows for sure and certain," said Martha. "Mr. Craven went off his head like when he were born. The doctors thought he'd have to be put in an asylum. It was because Mrs. Craven died, like I told you. He wouldn't set eyes on baby. He just raved and said it'd be another hunchback like him, and he'd had better die." "Is Colin a hunchback?" Mary asked. "He didn't look like one." He isn't yet, said Martha, but he began all wrong. Mother said that there was enough trouble raging in the house to set any child wrong. They was afraid his back were weak, and they'd always be taking care of it, keep him lying down and not letting him walk. Once they made him wear a brace, but he fretted so and he was downright ill. Then a big doctor came to see him and made him take it off. He talked to t'other doctor, quite rough, in a polite way. He said there'd been too much medicine and too much letting him have his own way. I think he's a very spoiled boy, said Mary. He's worse young now as ever was, said Martha. I won't say as he hasn't been ill a good bit. He's had coughs and colds that nearly killed him 2 or 3 times, and once he had rheumatic fever, and once he had typhoid. Mrs. Medlock did get a fright then. He'd been out of his head, and she was talking to the nurse, thinking he didn't know nothing, and she said, he'll die this time, sure enough, and best thing for him and for everybody. And she looked at him, and there he was with his big eyes open, staring at her, as sensible as she was herself. She didn't know what had happened, but he just stared at her and says, you give me some water and stop talking. Do you think he will die? Asked Mary. Mother says there's no reason why any child should live that gets no fresh air and don't do nothing but lie on his back and read picture books and take medicine. He's weak, and he hates the trouble of being taken out of doors, and he gets cold so easy it says it makes him ill. Mary sat and looked at the fire. I wonder, she said slowly, if it would not do him good to go out into a garden and watch things growing. It did me good. One of the worst fits he ever had, said Martha, was one time when they took him out where Roses by the fountain. He'd been reading in the paper about people getting something that he called rose cold, and he began to sneeze, and he said he got it, and then a new gardener, as didn't know rose, passed by and looked at him curious. He threw himself into a passion and said he'd looked at him because he was going to be hunchback. He cried himself into a fever, and he was ill all night. If he ever gets angry at me, I'll never go and see him again, said Mary. He'll have thee if he wants thee, said Martha. Thou may as well know that at the start. Very soon afterwards a bell rang, and she rolled up her knitting. I dare say nurse wants me to stay with him a bit, she said. I hope he's in good temper. She was out of the room for about 10 minutes, and then she came back with a puzzled expression. Well, thou has bewitched him, she said. He's up on his sofa with picture books. He's told nurse to stay away till 6 o'clock, and I'm to wait in the next room. The minute she were gone, he called me to him, and he says, I want Mary Lennox to come and talk to me, and remember, you're not to tell anyone. You better go as quick as you can. Mary was quite willing to go quickly. She did not want to see Colin as much as she wanted to see Dickon, but she did want to see him very much. There was a bright fire on the hearth when she entered his room, and in the daylight she saw it was a very beautiful room indeed. There were rich colours in the rugs and the hangings, and pictures and books on the walls, which made it look glowing and comfortable, even in spite of the grey sky and the falling rain. Colin looked rather like a picture himself. He was wrapped in a velvet dressing gown, and he sat against a big brocaded cushion. He had a red spot on each cheek. Come in, he said. I've been thinking about you all morning. I've been thinking about you too, answered Mary. You don't know how frightened Martha is. She says Mrs. Medlock would think she told me about you, and then she'll be sent away. He frowned. Go and tell her to come here, he said. She's in the next room. Mary went and brought her back, and poor Martha was shaking in her shoes. Colin was still frowning. Have you to do what I please, or have you not? He demanded. I have to do what you please, sir, Martha faltered, turning quite red. Has Medlock to do what I please? Everybody has, sir, said Martha. Well then, if I order you to bring Miss Mary to me, how can Medlock send you away if she finds out? Please don't let her, sir, pleaded Martha. I'll send her away if she dares to say a word about such a thing, said Master Craven grandly. She wouldn't like that, I can tell you. Oh, thank you, sir, bobbing a curtsy. I want to do my duty, sir. What I want is your duty, said Colin more grandly still. I'll take care of you. Now go away. When the door closed behind Martha, Colin found Mistress Mary gazing at him as he had set her wondering. Why do you look at me like that? He asked her. What are you thinking about? I'm thinking about 2 things. What are they? Sit down and tell me. This is the first one, said Mary, seating herself on the big stool. Once in India I saw a boy who was a Rajah. He had rubies and emeralds and diamonds stuck all over him. He spoke to his people just as you spoke to Martha. Everybody had to do everything he told them in a minute. I think they would have been killed if they hadn't. I shall make you tell me about Rajahs presently, he said. But first tell me what the second thing was. I was thinking, said Mary, how different you are from Dickon. Who's Dickon? He said. What a queer name. She might as well tell him, she thought. She could talk about Dickon without mentioning the secret garden. She had liked to hear Martha talk about him. Besides, she longed to talk about him. It would seem to bring him nearer. He's Martha's brother. He's 12 years old, she explained. He's not like anyone else in the world. He can charm foxes and squirrels and birds just as the natives in India charm snakes. He plays a very soft tune on a pipe, and they come and listen. There were some big books on the table at his side, and he dragged one suddenly towards him. There's a picture of a snake charmer in this, he exclaimed. Come and look at it. The book was a beautiful one with superbly coloured illustrations, and he turned to one of them. Can he do that? He asked eagerly. He played on his pipe and they listened, Mary explained. But he doesn't call it magic. He says it's because he's lived on the moors so much and he knows their ways. He says he feels sometimes as if he was a bird or a rabbit himself. He likes them so. I think he asked the robin questions, and it seemed as if they talked to each other in soft chirps.